Chapter 3. It was a perfect June day. Fields of corn was green and growing to the right and left of the road west. My turkeys sure looked fine plowing down the center of that road, their feathers gleaming in the sun. My, but they went at a clip once they got the feel of freedom beneath their feet. That first day we must have made 25 miles. Mr. Peace, he kept the mules going to the front of us, and the turkeys followed like he was a Pied Piper himself. Emmett, he thought he'd died and gone to heaven. He was that happy having tails to nip at and a flock to keep organized. And even better than all that, when we fixed the camp, we didn't need to dig into our supply of corn. Those birds just mowed down the surrounding grass before tucking up for the night. I started a cook fire, then lounged next to it while Mr. Peace flung some bacon slabs in the pan. "What kind of dog is Emmett, Mr. Peace?" I finally wondered aloud. "Well, now, he's a terrier. Terriers usually love to hunt. After today, though, seems to me he's got him a little sheepdog somewhere." "More'n a little." I smoothed the short hair of the dog splayed out on my lap. "I think Emmett's found his true calling." Come first light, I didn't have to do a thing with those turkeys. They was already gliding down from the trees they taken roost in, scrabbling about, some of 'em even heading off to the west. Never saw birds so keen to travel. Course then, Mr. Peace and I, we had to swallow our coffee and breakfast bacon right fast. Emmett was having a time keeping the birds from getting to Denver before we did. Things went along fairly fine all morning. We walked through the hamlet of Adamsburg, pretty much hogging the road. People saw us coming. They shook their heads in amazement. Carts and wagons, they tended more to see those huge striving turkeys as hordes of locusts. They pulled to the side of the dirt road and gave us plenty of leeway. It wasn't till we hit the town of Mount Sterling that we came up against something I hadn't given much thought to. Course, there was a lot of things in this life I hadn't given much thought to. Rivers was high up on that list. I'd set my eyes on the Missouri River a few times. That was on account of the fact that it wasn't but a few miles to the north of Uncle Lucas's farm, and Union, the town my school was in, where I'd found Bidwell Peace. I had talked some with Miss Rogers over the general plan of the trip, though. We decided to steer clear of the big river and stay with the road, far as it went. This was mostly because the railroad ran along the river. Now, I had a certain amount of faith in my birds, but I knew for a fact they wouldn't take to no railroad. My flock hadn't been too flighty yet, but set them next to a steaming, bellowing locomotive, and Hades only knew what mischief they'd get up to. Well, there wasn't any railroad in Mount Sterling. There was, however, the Gasconade River, just like that, moving due north to meet up with the Missouri, blocking our way west. Mr. Peace, he pulled the wagon to a halt just above the ferry landing. The ferry boat was loading up to go across. Mr. Peace looked back at me and the birds. "How we going to get them turkeys on that little ferry boat, Simon? Take about 30 trips to pass them across." He pulled off his slouch hat to swipe at his forehead. "Then there's the toll to consider. Toll on 1,000 birds that'd almost wipe us out complete." I took in the sight with some trepidation. It weren't a huge river like to the Missouri, but that Gasconade was sure and certain too deep and fast to wade across. Meanwhile, my birds were flocking up around me, excited like, crowding near the banks of the river, gobbling and clicking their little silly heads off. Emmett was standing stock still, not sure what was required of him. Behind us all, a few dozen of the townsfolks were starting to take an interest in our situation. "Who? Where's these folks think they's a-goin'?" "Haw! Going to drown them birds and put 'em out of their misery. Why don't we save 'em the trouble? I could fancy me a turkey supper tonight. How about you, George?" "Now that you mentions it, Elmer, I could too. Easy. I considered the men closing in on us. Then I twisted around to study the river again. I wasn't brought up to quick thought, but quick thought was needed at that moment. What happened to birds that was riled good and proper? I knew the answer to that one, but could my turkeys be counted on to perform what came natural to them? I bent down to Emmett. His pointy little ears was already cocked, waiting for my orders. "Go get 'em, boy. Chase those turkeys straight into the river." Emmett gave me an odd look for an instant, but I stood firm. Then I rounded to one side of the flock and let out a huge rumpus. Emmett took off to the other side, the way we've been doing for a day and a half. This time, though, he set into barking up a storm. Together, we drove our birds to the very brink of the Gasconade River. Then we drove them into it. Except they didn't go into the river. Instead, they spread their wings and flew straight and clear all the way across that water. I held my breath, amazed at the wonder of it. Those bronze feathers surely did look a beautiful sight, sweeping so graceful through the sky. When the turkeys came to the other side, I was still holding my breath. Would they just keep on flying away from me forever? I could see Miss Rogers' lifetime savings floating off to the great beyond, to some turkey Zion in the sky. My breath returned when they set themselves down again, nice as you please, and there they stood. That entire flock was waiting on me on the other side of the river. They even raised their heads after they'd settled their wings again, raised their heads and peered back across like to say, "What are you waiting on, Simon? We're over here." I swung toward Bidwell Peace. He'd gone pale as a ghost under his sunburn. Slowly he clapped the hat back atop his sparse hair and jostled the reins still gripped in one hand. Sparky and Snowball led the mule team down the riverbank and onto the waiting ferry boat. Emmett and me followed. As the boat was casting off, I looked back up at the townsfolk. They were in a clump, sort of shambling from one foot to the other, still too disbelieving to say aught. "A turkey supper'll cost you $5 the bird," I shouted back to them, "but you'll have to come to Denver to get it." Those birds must have been more tuckered out from their exertions than they looked. We hadn't made more than a mile or two after the river when we passed through a nice stand of hickory and black walnut. Without a by your leave, my turkeys took to the trees, roosting for the night. All it needed was for one of them to have the idea, and pretty soon the entire 1,000 birds was settled in, reddish-purple heads poked under their wings. It happened so fast, I had to yell Mr. Peace in the wagon back. He swiveled his neck from the mules, then his eyes went wide. "Where are them birds?" I pointed up to the trees. His bony Adam's apple stretched up with his neck as he verified what he couldn't believe. "But it's hardly 3 in the afternoon." "Right. You want to get 'em back down?" "No." He slumped down from the wagon seat. "But I would like a drink. Don't think all this drama is good for my heart." I handed him the water jug. He shoved it aside. "Warn't the sort of drink I had me in mind of." I took a drink. Only kind of drink you'll be seeing till Denver, if that 10% still interests you. Mr. Peace stared longingly down the road we just traveled. "It's only a couple of miles back to town. I'll be here in camp before nightfall." I took another drink. By nightfall, I'd have me another drover. He nodded. "The way you do things, you probably would at that." He pulled himself together and brightened some. "Seeing as how we're stuck here for the duration, I might as well take the opportunity to whip up one of my culinary delights." I spit out a mouthful of water. "What is a culinary delight?" "Gather some kindling, Simon. Lots of kindling. You're about to learn some new tricks." By sundown, the smell of Mr. Peace's culinary delight must have been wafting through 3 counties. least enough so that we picked up a stray to join us for supper. In point of fact, I hadn't helped much in creating that supper, aside from gathering firewood. After I'd got a good pile growing near the wagon, I took off back to the woods to where this stream we'd been following wandered. Then I pulled off my boots and woolen socks and sank my toes into the water. It felt just fine after all the miles I'd put beneath these feet the last 2 days. More miles than I'd ever gone in my entire life, seemed like. Next thing you know, I was sleeping like a baby. Least I must have drifted off, 'cause when I came to again, darkness had started settling down through the leaves over my head. I propped myself up on my elbow and yawned. Then I jumped. Who's there? Seemed like a face was staring at me from across the stream. A dark face. Nobody. I sat up. Nobody can't talk, can he? I mean, it stands to reason. If nobody is truly not there, then... The face came closer, followed by a body that splashed through the stream. I gives up. I gives myself up to you, master. You looks harmless enough. Just feed me. Just feed me. I'm that hungry. Whoa, now. I straightened my back. I ain't nobody's master and never mean to be. Even Uncle Lucas never kept no slaves. I stopped to consider. Then again, maybe he figured he had enough between me and Aunt Maybelle and the cousins. Don't know what you's going on about, but I'm hungry, master. That smell came through clear to the other side of the woods, and my nose done led me to you. I'm giving myself up. You can get the reward. Beyond caring is what I am. Just feed me. I finally remembered about my boots and socks. Hold on a minute till I get these on. Then I was up, standing next to a boy about my age. My height, too, if he was to stop bowing and scraping long enough to tell. Even with that, you could see he weren't hardly more than skin and bones next to me. Now let's start over again, without this master folderol. I'm Simon Green. Who are you besides hungry and nobody? He finally grinned. Jath Baloo from down in. I held up a hand. Don't want to know where from, but you hear somebody hollering? That'd be Mr. Peace. I reckon his culinary delight's about ready to eat, and from the size of the pot he was cooking it in, there's bound to be enough for 3. Mr. Peace, he hardly even blinked when he saw me coming out of the woods, followed by that truly scrawny black boy. Company for supper? Good. Got enough for an army here, and I like my bean pie to be appreciated. I moved closer to the bubbling cauldron. Aunt Maybelle's old iron pot sure and certain hadn't smelled this good when I liberated it from the back shed where she stowed used-up things. Bean pie? I sniffed again. Bean and bacon and molasses pie, Mr. Peace expanded. Invented it myself. I turned to our company. Set yourself down, Jath, before you collapse. Hope you don't mind eating out of the fry pan, 'cause we only got 2 tin plates to our names. Jath Baloo didn't do no more kowtowing after he'd eaten. He'd stuffed himself too full. He lounged there in the darkness, surrounding the fire, groaning blissfully for about 15 minutes while Mr. Peace and I played with our toothpicks. Then he finally spoke. There was a mighty fine crust, Mr. Peace, sir. Flaky on top and juicy underneath. My compliments. Thank ye, Mr. Peace drawled. Took some pains with it. I knowed it. If my mama was alive, even she couldn't top it. That sparked my interest some. You an orphan, Jath? Like me? Recent, he said. Just recent, which is why I took off. He belched gently and rubbed his distended stomach. Figured I'd make for the Kansas Territory and freedom. Funny thing, Mr. Peace started. But Kansas Territory is where we're headed, I finished. Near as far as it goes. near as far as the Utah Territory. Jabesh Baloo's black eyes glinted with the firelight. He grinned for the second time since I'd met him. End of chapter 3.